Have you ever felt that there is a silent kind of knowledge spread across history, yet always just out of reach for most people? An invisible thread connecting alchemists, philosophers, magicians, scientists, and even artists. If so, you may have already sensed the presence of Hermeticism, not as an old doctrine, but as a force moving through civilizations. Today, I want you to walk with me through this hidden corridor of history. And as we walk, ask yourself, why has this knowledge remained alive for more than 3,000 years? Before we talk about symbols, alchemy, or mysteries, we need to go back to the beginning, not to the Egypt you know from school textbooks, but to the esoteric Egypt of closed temples where only initiates had access to reserved teachings. There emerges the enigmatic figure of Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great. But wait, who was Hermes really? A man? A myth? A compilation of sages? And why do entire civilizations claim he was the father of philosophy, magic, and science all at once? When we speak of Hermes Trismegistus, we enter a porous zone between myth and history. Some see him as a single Egyptian sage. Others read the name as a seal uniting various traditions. The essential point, however, is not to determine his biography, but to recognize the function this myth performs, to serve as a vessel for teachings that crossed languages and eras. Ask yourself, what must a myth possess to survive for so long? Symbolic resilience, and a correspondence between its images and the inner experience of those who encounter it. Alexandria was the cauldron where many of these currents met. There, Greek philosophers translated Egyptian scrolls, medieval alchemists preserved fragments, and Hermetic texts were copied, commented on, and sometimes deliberately disguised. This selective circulation explains, in part, why Hermeticism feels simultaneously familiar and inaccessible. Familiar because it touches universal structures, inaccessible because it was transmitted through pathways that demand an interpretative leap. And what is so powerful about these universal structures? They function as molds, repeated patterns that organize images, dreams, and actions. Think of the symbol of the caduceus: two paths, a central line, dynamic balance. This pattern reappears in myth, medicine, and psychology. When a pattern stops being just an image and begins to organize behavior, we reach the core of what we call an initiatory tradition. Not doctrine, but perceptual equipment. Now I want you to make a practical observation. Throughout your day, notice an image that returns frequently. A dream, a gesture, a phrase. That may be an echo of the same pattern that traveled across centuries. And if you're willing to look at this echo as a sign instead of dismissing it, you'll begin to understand why certain symbols insist. They don't merely represent the world, they build it. When we think about these symbols that build the world, we step into the territory where Hermeticism becomes less a philosophy and more a technology of attention. Instead of asking, "What does this mean?" the Hermeticist asks, "What does this activate within me?" This shift in perspective is crucial. The ancients didn't study symbols as someone dissecting a dead object, but as someone handling living forces. To them, a symbol was a doorway, and every doorway reveals only what the traveler is prepared to see. And it is here that Hermeticism begins to show its historical function. It didn't arise to explain the physical world, but to train human perception on a subtler level. That's why the temples were closed, why the texts were encoded, why the narratives assumed mythic forms. It wasn't about hiding knowledge out of elitism, but about preserving tools that could easily be misunderstood if approached solely through logic. Myth, ritual, and metaphor were safe vessels for things that surpassed mere words. As we advance along the Hermetic path, we realize that its true power never lay in esoteric formulas or elaborate rituals, but in the way it reorganizes the relationship between mind and reality. The ancients claimed that the universe is mental, not as poetic metaphor, but as experiential insight. Everything we perceive passes through internal filters before crystallizing into events. This principle, so repeated, so misunderstood, was less a dogma and more a guideline for adjusting consciousness, not to create illusions, but to remove distortions. And when we observe history, we notice that Hermeticists have always been attentive readers of these distortions. They investigated the mind as one investigates a labyrinth. Every belief, every image, every impulse was seen as a thread that, if followed, revealed the structure of the self. That is why Hermeticism was embraced by alchemists, mystics, and philosophers. It offered a method to look inward without getting lost inside. This quiet, profound function is what ensured its survival across the centuries. But what truly distinguishes Hermeticism from other traditions is its refusal to separate the inner world from the outer one. For Hermes, everything that moves within the soul finds its reflection in the world, and everything that happens in the world finds a correspondence within the soul. This reciprocity, so simple at first glance, profoundly changes the way we interpret human experience. There is no isolated event, no neutral symbol. Everything participates in a network of meanings that interweave continuously. And the clearer this interweaving becomes, the more everyday life reveals layers that were once invisible. This perspective doesn't arise as morality or commandment, but as direct observation. Hermeticists studied patterns, and the patterns repeated. Emotions generated circumstances, the imagination shaped behavior, silent beliefs guided entire destinies. When we understand this mechanism, we stop seeing life as a random sequence and begin to perceive its symbolic architecture. And that perception, by itself, is transformative. Not because it immediately changes the facts, but because it alters the way we position ourselves in front of them. By recognizing the symbolic architecture, we reach a point where Hermeticism stops being just a lens and begins to function as a kind of map of consciousness. Every myth works as a landmark, every correspondence as a coordinate. It's as if the ancients had perceived something that psychology is only now beginning to explore, that the mind doesn't operate solely through logic, but through primordial images that shape perception before thought even arises. The Hermetic student learns to identify these images and observes how they silently mold their life. And it is precisely this ability to perceive the invisible operating within the visible that made Hermeticism a meeting point among different traditions. It doesn't matter whether we speak of Egyptian rituals, Greek philosophy, medieval alchemy, or modern psychology. All of them, in their own way, attempted to map this inner territory. The difference is that Hermeticism offered a map that didn't age. It remains functional because it doesn't describe specific beliefs, but constant structures of human experience. Structures that you, even without knowing, already use every day. But to prevent this understanding from remaining abstract, we need to observe how these ideas shaped entire generations of thinkers. The Hermetic tradition served as a bridge between Egyptian thought, Greek philosophy, and early Christian mysticism. Later, it influenced medieval alchemists, stimulated the birth of the natural sciences, and deeply resonated with Jungian psychology. This was no coincidence. Hermeticism acts as a living symbol, capable of crossing centuries without losing its essence. It adapts to time, preserving its core while reshaping its outer form. And perhaps the most fascinating aspect is this: even if someone has never heard the word Hermeticism, they still live within its laws. Every decision made, every emotion that arises, every repeating pattern, all of it expresses principles that Hermes described millennia ago. Study doesn't grant new powers, it simply illuminates mechanisms that were always in operation. And this revelation quietly changes the way you move through the world, because understanding the invisible gears of human experience is what transforms chaotic flow into conscious direction. But before we go deeper, notice something. The further we enter this territory, the clearer it becomes that Hermeticism is not an external doctrine, but an internal movement of consciousness. We're not studying an ancient system. We're recognizing patterns that were already operating within us, quietly. And it's right here that many readers feel that almost physical click, as if a piece finally fell into place. It's a reminder that true initiation doesn't happen in temples, but in the moment you realize you were always part of the process. And perhaps this is the most unsettling part, realizing that the entire tradition seems to speak directly to you. as if each symbol had been waiting for centuries for your attention, as if every myth were a coded message that activates only when someone looks at it with depth. That sensation of being called is no accident. It is one of the mechanisms that sustained Hermeticism from the beginning. It doesn't impose, it signals, and whoever recognizes that signal inevitably keeps walking. Now, with this foundation prepared, we can enter an even deeper layer: the internal logic of Hermetic transformation. Hermeticism begins with the premise that the human being is not finished. He is in process. And this process doesn't unfold through accumulation of knowledge, but through internal reorganization. That's why its texts feel enigmatic. They don't want to inform, they want to restructure. Reading Hermes is like adjusting lenses you didn't even know were misaligned. Suddenly, something shifts, and the world shifts with it. And when this reorganization begins, experience gains a new texture. Small things acquire significance, patterns become visible, choices feel less random. It's as if a second layer of reality, previously imperceptible, begins to emerge. Tradition calls this the opening of inner sight. Modern psychology might call it the expansion of symbolic awareness. You can call it whatever you like, the name is irrelevant. What matters is the effect. Life, once opaque, begins to reveal its structure, and this is where an essential point emerges, perhaps one of the most transformative in the entire journey. The realization that the outer world and the inner world are not separate domains, but different manifestations of the same process. This understanding, simple on the surface, but radical in its consequences, changes how you respond to events. Situations that once felt like obstacles begin to appear as signals. Conflicts stop being enemies and become teachers, and what once seemed like pure chaos begins to organize itself into understandable patterns. But understanding this intellectually is not enough. The real shift happens when you notice, almost viscerally, that every movement of your mind reverberates through the field of your life, that every emotion is an active force, that every decision sets a direction in the flow. This responsibility may feel heavy at first. After all, it's much easier to blame the world, but it's also liberating, because for the first time, you realize you are not imprisoned by circumstances. You are actively participating in creating them. And maybe you're wondering, but how does this show up in everyday life? How do I perceive in practice this interaction between inside and outside? The answer doesn't come as a formula. It comes as perception. It's when you notice certain situations repeat until you change internally. When you see that different people reproduce the same pattern because you're still emitting the same emotional response. When you realize that reality seems to echo what you haven't transformed yet. This is the Hermetic principle in action. Like attracts like, not as mysticism, but as psychological dynamics. And the moment this perception settles in, something changes deeply. You stop seeing life as a random sequence of events and begin to perceive it as a dialogue between your consciousness and the invisible fabric that sustains your experiences. And it's at this point that many people begin to feel a kind of silent empowerment, not loud, not triumphant, but intimate. Because for the first time you realize you can adjust the dialogue, you can change the tone, you can change the frequency. And when you do, everything around you begins to respond. And when this understanding matures, you begin to notice something even more subtle. It's not only events that align with your inner state. Opportunities change shape as well. Doors that once seemed shut begin to open slightly. Casual conversations reveal unexpected paths. Ideas that were dormant for years suddenly gain momentum. This isn't magic in a caricatured sense, it's coherence. When you change the center, the periphery responds, and that response, when consciously perceived, creates a sense of convergence, as if life were rearranging the scenery so you can move forward. But here comes the critical point, and I want you to pay attention. This convergence doesn't mean comfort. Many times, reality begins to remove what is no longer in harmony with your new internal state. Relationships drift apart, habits become unbearable, paths that once made sense become too narrow. And it's exactly at this moment that many people retreat, thinking something went wrong. when in fact, the opposite is true. This is the Hermetic process working perfectly. Life removes the old so the new doesn't encounter obstacles. The question is, can you move through this phase without turning back? And to move through this phase, there is a Hermetic key that is rarely discussed, yet appears repeatedly in ancient texts: the need for inner vigilance. Not vigilance as tension, but as presence. It's the ability to observe your own states before they take hold of you, to see the impulse before the reaction, to perceive resentment before it becomes a narrative. This vigilance is the point of mutation because it allows you to choose, consciously choose. Without it, you simply repeat patterns. With it, you begin to reorganize the flow. And perhaps you felt this happen before, that moment when for a split second, you realize you could react the same way you always have, but something in you chooses differently. That instant is alchemical. It's too small to celebrate, but deep enough to change the course of a life. Because this is where Hermeticism stops being a set of philosophical ideas and becomes living practice. This is where theory becomes transformation. And it's here you realize the true alchemical laboratory was never in metals, it was always in you. And it is precisely when this perception begins to consolidate that you understand why so many ancient traditions insisted on the metaphor of the inner work. It's not about moral purification, but about perceptual refinement. You begin to distinguish with more clarity what arises from old conditioning and what emerges from your true intention. And the more you perceive this difference, the more you feel that there is a you who observes and another who reacts. This separation is the beginning of autonomy, because for the first time, you're not being dragged by the current, you're seeing the current. And in seeing the current, something surprising happens. The cycles that once felt inevitable begin to lose their strength. Situations that repeated for years start to dissolve, not because you fought against them, but because you stopped feeding them with the same internal responses. This change is so silent that sometimes you only notice it after weeks or months, when you realize that something that once destabilized you no longer has the same impact. And this is one of the clearest signs that the Hermetic work is taking effect. The world is still the same, but you are not. And when you realize that you no longer respond the same way, a new question emerges, and perhaps you've already felt it approaching. If I can change my responses, then how far can I change my reality? This question doesn't arise from ambition, but from clarity, because once you recognize that you've always reacted from unconscious impulses, you begin to test new possibilities, you begin to experiment with new internal movements, and little by little, you notice that each mental choice is like a subtle adjustment that alters the course of external events. But here lies a crucial detail. This expansion doesn't happen in a straight line. It unfolds through advances and regressions, through clarity and shadow. And you need to remember this so you don't get lost. Hermeticism never promised an easy path. It promised a real one. And a real requires confrontation. It requires walking through the discomfort of seeing yourself without filters. It requires admitting that many times we are the architects of our own prisons. But it also offers the most valuable key of all: the certainty that once you recognize these patterns, you can dissolve them. You can rebuild yourself. You can finally assume the role of protagonist in your own story. And it's exactly at this point that many return to Hermeticism with new eyes. Before, it seemed like just a collection of symbols, myths, and ancient metaphors. Now, it begins to reveal itself as a psychological map, a guide for navigating the complexity of consciousness itself. When Hermes says, "as above, so below, as within, so without," he's not describing a metaphysical dogma. He's describing a mechanism that operates within you every day, whether you notice it or not. And when you finally perceive it, it's as if a silent gear inside your mind begins to turn in a different rhythm. And this shift in gears produces a curious effect. You begin to see patterns where before you saw only isolated events. You start noticing that certain choices always lead to the same kind of outcome. You begin to recognize that certain types of people only show up in your life when you're vibrating at a particular internal state. And as you observe this, a nearly archaeological feeling arises, as if you were excavating the deeper layers of your own life, discovering structures that were always there, but only now becoming visible. And then comes the next step, and it may be one of the most delicate, learning to act from this new perception, without falling into the trap of trying to control everything. Because here lies an essential Hermetic paradox. You influence the world, but you do not dominate it. You direct the flow, but you don't force it. Like a skilled sailor who adjusts the sail, but doesn't control the wind. And when you understand this, you begin to act with more precision and less anxiety. Your choices become subtler, more intelligent, more aligned with what you truly wish to experience. And with that subtlety, something new begins to emerge, a kind of quiet confidence. It's not empty optimism, it's not positive thinking. It is the confidence of someone who has learned to read the signs of their own path. Someone who knows when to advance and when to wait. Someone who knows that every internal movement has external repercussions, and that by acting with awareness, life becomes less of a maze and more of a continuous conversation. A conversation you have finally learned to listen to. But there is a detail few notice, and this is where things become truly interesting. When you begin to see that life responds to your inner state, an uncomfortable question inevitably arises. Who is speaking to me when the world responds? This is one of the oldest doors in Hermeticism, and also one of the most delicate. It's not about believing that the universe conspires, but about realizing that consciousness, by observing, alters the way it organizes experience itself. The world isn't sending you coded messages. You are beginning to recognize the structure that has always been there. And it's precisely in this recognition that a different way of living is born. A life in which you stop reacting automatically and begin responding consciously, where every situation ceases to be mere coincidence and becomes information. And this has a curious effect. You become less vulnerable to external chaos, not because the world changes, but because your interpretation changes. You gain an inner space, a gap between stimulus and response. And it's in that gap that true freedom begins. Now, notice what begins to happen as this inner freedom expands. You realize that certain situations no longer affect you the same way. Old triggers lose their power. Emotions that once overwhelmed you become more transparent, like waves you can observe without being dragged under. This is the beginning of Hermetic mastery, not the ability to control the world, but to become intimate with your own internal dynamics. And the more intimacy you build, the clearer the invisible map organizing your life becomes, and gradually, something even deeper is revealed. You begin to feel that you are not simply living inside a reality, but with it. Like two synchronized movements. There's no arrogance in this, there's perceptual maturity. Hermeticism always taught that what is above is like what is below, but true understanding arrives when you realize that this phrase does not describe the cosmos, it describes you. Correspondence is not an external law, it is an internal mirror. And once that mirror becomes clear, the journey stops being confusing and becomes revelatory. And then we reach a point that for many feels almost paradoxical. As you gain more inner clarity, the world doesn't become simpler, it becomes more transparent. The same situations still happen, the same people cross your path, the same challenges reappear, but something fundamental has changed. You. And that change alters everything, because meaning is not in the events themselves, but in the interpretation you give them. Hermeticism has always emphasized this. It's not what happens, it's what it awakens in you. And maybe you've already felt this at some moment in your life, that strange sensation when an old situation, one that used to destabilize you, suddenly passes through you like wind. Not because the situation changed, but because your internal structure no longer reacts the same way. This is a milestone in the Hermetic journey. It's the indicator that you've stopped being a spectator of your own life and have begun to take part in shaping the experience. It's discreet, almost silent, but profound. And here I want you to notice something subtle yet crucial. As this transformation unfolds, you begin to see connections where before you saw only fragments. Life stops looking like a broken mosaic and becomes a continuous tapestry. The ancients called this symbolic vision, the ability to perceive that everything, absolutely everything, carries a correspondence. It's not superstition. It's not caricatured magic. It's sensitivity. Sensitivity to recognize that internal and external patterns dance together in an ancient choreography. And the more this symbolic vision develops, the more you see that nothing is isolated. A meeting, a sentence, a mistake, a delay, a dream. Everything starts to feel like part of a flow that teaches you. And this is a radical shift, because it turns life into continuous learning. Not academic learning, but existential learning. With each new day, you understand a little more about yourself. And this is exactly the kind of understanding Hermes Trismegistus sought to preserve. A wisdom that does not depend on belief, but on direct perception. But perhaps the most surprising part of all this is not the transformation itself, but the moment you realize that this journey is not unique to you. It exists in all of humanity, in every culture, in every era. The search for meaning, for clarity, for internal coherence, all of it is universal. Hermeticism survived for 3,000 years not because it was secret, but because it was true. Because it described something everyone experiences, even without ever hearing the word Hermes. And that's why when you dive into these teachings, you're not merely studying an ancient tradition, you're studying yourself. You're recognizing mechanisms that were always active, even if you had never named them. And when you name something internal, you illuminate it. And when you illuminate, you understand. And when you understand, you transform. This is the moment when the Hermetic journey stops being historical and becomes personal. As if a mirror, once fogged, begins to reveal a familiar face, your own. Now, before we move to the final section, I want you to mentally return to the beginning of this episode. Back there, we talked about an invisible thread connecting different eras, different minds, different traditions. Well, that thread isn't something you find in books. It's something you feel. It's the intuition that an underlying order exists, a coherence that doesn't need to be explained to be perceived. And Hermeticism has always been the language of that order. And the closer you get to that language, the clearer it becomes that it was never meant to control the world, but to understand it. To understand why certain patterns repeat, why certain wounds appear, why certain choices return. It's as if you were learning to read a text that has always been in front of you, but that until now seemed written in code. And suddenly, letter by letter, syllable by syllable, you begin to decipher it, interpret, to observe, to question, and above all, to perceive where your own limits are. Hermeticism doesn't promise instant elimination. It promises gradual lucidity. And it is this lucidity that over time radically transforms your relationship with reality. And maybe you're already beginning to feel this as you listen to this episode, a slight shift in how you perceive yourself. It's not a loud revolution, it's a silent reorganization. As if a part of you, a part that always knew these truths, finally had space to emerge. And that emergence is the beginning of transmutation, not the metallic alchemy of laboratories, but the inner alchemy that turns perception into consciousness. And here we arrive at a key point of this entire episode, the understanding that the hidden history of Hermeticism is not just the story of texts, temples, or traditions. It is the story of the evolution of consciousness. Each generation reinterpreted Hermes in its own way, but all sought the same thing: to understand the nature of the mind and its relationship with the world. Because in the end, that is what Hermeticism is, a deep investigation into how we perceive, how we feel, how we assign meaning. And when you understand this, you see that this tradition didn't survive millennia despite the world changing. It survived because the world changed. Because it adapts, reorganizes, translates itself. And you do the same. With each new experience, you become slightly different, slightly more conscious, slightly more capable of seeing patterns where before you saw confusion. Hermeticism simply accelerates a process already happening naturally. And perhaps now you're wondering, but what's the next step? The answer isn't practical, isn't technical, isn't ritualistic. The next step is to keep observing. Observing your thoughts, your patterns, your reactions. Observing the silent dialogue between what you feel and what you experience. Because this constant observation, when done sincerely, is the true portal of Hermetic initiation. There is no other. And that's why so many ancient texts insist on the same idea: know thyself. Not as motivational advice, but as practical guidance. Because when you know yourself, you're not only understanding your inner world, you're understanding the mechanism that organizes your experience of reality. You're understanding the relationship between the visible and the invisible, between cause and effect, between emotion and creation. And this understanding changes absolutely everything. And so we reach the end of this journey through one of the oldest and deepest chapters of human history. But before you leave this episode, I want to leave you with a question, perhaps the most important of all. What is beginning to take shape inside you now? Because Hermeticism isn't meant to impress or entertain. It's meant to reveal. And revelation always happens within, never outside. So carry this awareness with you. You are not simply learning about an ancient tradition. You are learning about yourself. And if you continue moving forward, block by block, principle by principle, you'll discover that Hermes never spoke of external magic. He always spoke of the magic of perceiving, of connecting, of understanding. And that magic is available now, in this very moment, as you breathe. And in the next episode, we'll step directly into the heart of this perception, the 7 Hermetic principles. Not as mystical laws of the universe, but as psychological archetypes that structure everything you think, feel, and create. If today you understood the terrain, tomorrow we begin unveiling the invisible mechanism that drives your reality.